In the wake of Hurricane Katrina, American journalism seems to have found or rediscovered its voice and its reason for being. Hard questions are being asked, primarily because the journalists were on the ground doing their job before the American government was on the ground doing its job. Now, one would hope that the spine that American journalists have suddenly rediscovered, that the hard questions that they are asking of the American president, the probing that they're now doing into the competence of the rescue efforts will continue in the future. But you know, since 9/11, there has been a tendency for many journalists to duck criticizing the White House for fear that it will be seen as unpatriotic. This sort of hard, no-holds-barred questioning that President Bush has rarely been subjected to has suddenly reappeared. Now, the question is how long this will last, whether there is a need for some other forum, some other type of broadcast that is absolutely free to question the president, is absolutely free to call the shots if they see it. And that, I would hope, would be the role of independent world television. What we saw when Katrina was approaching the Gulf Coast, and what we heard was that this was a huge storm. And then we heard, whoop, it just turned right, and New Orleans has been saved from a catastrophe. There was no mention beforehand of the possibility, the very real likelihood, that this great bowl that is New Orleans would be flooded. Now, despite the fact that FEMA had run an exercise just a year or two before, predicating a hurricane with, I forget what it is, 120 or 140 mile an hour winds that hit New Orleans. And indeed, FEMA found out that it did exactly that. It flooded the city, and there would have been endless casualties. There was a report in the New Orleans Times-Picayune several years ago, which also talked about a Category 1 storm and what it would do to the city of New Orleans. But you didn't hear much about that in the rest of the country. And you certainly didn't hear much about it on nationwide network television. Many Americans saw a world after Katrina that they simply overlook or walk on by or pay no attention to. The poverty, the racial problems are very real indeed. That's the sort of thing that an independent broadcaster should be looking at, should be periodically revisiting. The level of poverty in the United States, the hidden problems that most Americans don't see. It shouldn't take a catastrophe like Katrina to reveal it to the general public. After 9/11, there really was some fear in the newsroom. Anchors, correspondents were afraid of being labeled unpatriotic. It was almost seen as treason to be questioning actions of the government, despite the fact that we as journalists know that real patriotism means questioning the people who are supposed to be protecting us, questioning their competence, trying to dig and probe to see where the government is doing its job. There hasn't been much of that since 9/11. The 1990s were really a low period for American journalism. We were at war, and the country didn't know it. There was the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center. In the mid-1990s, there was the attack on American barracks in Saudi Arabia. In the latter part of the 1990s, there were the attacks on American embassies in Africa. These were reported, but nowhere was there enough reporting of behind the scenes, connecting the dots, trying to explain to the American public who these people were who were trying to blow Americans to bits and why they were trying to do this. Now, one would have thought that 9/11 would have ended all of that, and indeed, for a brief period after the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, the mainstream media, and especially the commercial television, sent out their troops, beat the bushes, went after the Al-Qaeda story, tried to find out what was coming down the road. It didn't last because, frankly, there is still very little interest by the commercial broadcasters in investigative reporting. They're more interested in the bottom line. They're more interested in ratings, and that means more infotainment, more Michael Jackson, more that sort of thing, and not an awful lot of good old-fashioned investigative reporting, which means a lot of time, a lot of effort, and no immediate results. In 1997, I arranged with a producer in London to set up an interview with Osama Bin Laden. It was at a time when he was looking for publicity, wanted to get his message out. And unbelievable to me, the management of CBS in New York wasn't interested. He was felt to be of only marginal interest to America's viewers. That's the sort of problem that you face when the bottom line, when meeting profit margins is more important than serving the public, which the media are supposed to do. Unbelievably, the gatekeepers and the people who own the main news organizations were so focused on the circulation, on ratings, that they completely overlooked a story that was there underneath their nose. You remember at the beginning of 2001, there was the Hart-Rudman Commission, a highly credible government commission which studied the threat of al-Qaeda and concluded that at some time in the future, there would be an attack on the United States, and in all probability, large numbers of Americans would die. Not only was that not heeded, it was barely reported. And indeed, in the summer leading up to 9/11, the big story on mainstream television was shark attacks. Shark attacks. And it wasn't even a very bad season for that. There was no mention at all in the few months preceding 9/11, to my knowledge, on either any of the big three networks of the words al-Qaeda. Well, there's no question that this White House, and I must say other White Houses too, played the same sort of game. If you ask too many hard questions, you're not going to get the interview, or you're going to be way down at the end of the list before you get the next interview. So there's self-censorship there too. Journalists are afraid to go in and push and ask and then take the follow-up question. And indeed, the current White House isn't used to that sort of questioning. The sort of thing the president got when he visited the hurricane and flood area was most unusual. It's rare nowadays for an American president to be really pinned to the mat. The consequences of there being no reporting at all on al-Qaeda and very little mention of Osama bin Laden was that Mohamed Atta, who we now know was one of the ringleaders of the 9/11 attack, a few months before the 9/11 attacks, went to Florida and went to a Department of Agriculture loan officer to ask for a loan to buy a small plane. And he explained he wanted to take the seats out, put a great big tank in it, fill it up with chemicals, and use it as a crop duster. Well, the loan officer turned it down, thought it was a foolish idea. And then Mohamed Atta looked at a map on her wall and saw it was a map of Washington, and he asked her to point out where the White House is and where the Pentagon is. And then he started to talk about, he said, have you ever heard of an organization of people overseas who were dissatisfied with their governments? It's called al-Qaeda. And he said, there is a person who someday will be a great man, and his name is Osama Bin Laden. And of course, none of this rang a bell with the Department of Agriculture loan officer, and it wasn't until after 9/11 that she suddenly recognized Mohamed Atta's picture in the newspapers and went to the FBI, and sure enough, the original plan of the 9/11 hijackers was to use small planes and fill them with explosives and drive them into buildings. Now, there is a might have been.